Into the kidnapping and murder of the Cradock Four has once again turned the spotlight onto non-prosecution of apartheid-era crimes. The inquest has been hearing testimony on the deaths of Matthew Goniwe, Fort Kalata, Sparrow Mkonto and Strelo Mhlauli. They were abducted and murdered by South African security police in June of 1985. Let's bring into the discussion Yasmin Sooka, who is a human rights lawyer and also a former TRC Commissioner. Yasmin, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us. And this sentiment has been echoed by a number of people, but particularly the families and the children of the Cradock Four. It's just one of many apartheid-era crimes. But the fact that they were let down not only at the time of the deaths of their fathers, their husbands, but also by the new democratic government.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I mean, this inquest is the third inquest. You know, there were two inquests before, and at the second inquest, while the head of the inquest fingered the security police as being responsible for their deaths, he didn't name them, and neither did he talk about the State Security Council. So now, 40 years later, and after making a number of efforts, finally, the families are in court. And for them, it's a very different experience because this time around, they are playing a role and they're not passive bystanders. They're actually testifying to what they heard about the abductions and murders. And they also speak to the pain of their own journey, having come so far. I think what's extraordinary about this is that on the one hand, you have the widows of the Cradock Four, and bear in mind that Mrs. Goniwe passed away with one of her daughters. But in fact, it is the next generation, the sons led by Lucanio Kalata, that has really been pushing for the inquest and really making sure that he leaves no stone unturned to ensure that the family is able to access accountability. At the same time, this week when they testified, these were really painful stories because they traced, you know, the fact that for most of them, they grew up without knowing their fathers, only hearing about them and hearing about the heroic, role that they played in Cradock. You know, on Tuesday last week, the families went down to Cradock as part of the delegation with a judge to do an inspection in loco. And it meant going back to their homes, but also the place where they were constantly surveilled. Then on the Wednesday, it was the case of looking for the vehicle and also all the places where the bodies had been found. And for some of the families, this was the first time that they were doing this. And when they described, you know, they heard about how gruesome the murders were. I think you can imagine that that's really bringing about a call that there should be some justice and accountability.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the in loco inspection that was conducted and the fact that there have been two other inquests into the murder of the Cradock Four. It's a disservice, to put it so mildly, on the families, Yasmin, for them to have to, yet again, through another inquest, relive the worst moments of their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the reason, you know, some people just call it secondary victimization, but actually what we're talking about is really the obstruction of justice. And in our view, that obstruction of justice came from the ruling party who were at the head of the state. And in the period between 2003 and 2017, we believe that they have a case to answer as to why they didn't do anything about investigation or prosecution. We also learned, of course, that there was a moratorium on making either security branch, you know, the investigators available or the prosecutors. And this is the reason why 25 families led by the Kalata family and the Foundation for Human Rights have launched this case in the Constitutional Court for three purposes. The one is to get a declaration of their rights, that their rights were violated. The second is around the question of constitutional damages. And the third is around the setting up of a commission of inquiry to investigate the political interference. Now, last week, the president did accede to setting up a commission of inquiry, and he announced that Judge Sisi Kampepe will chair it. But first two elements, which is the declaration and the question of the constitutional damages in the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry. And to be frank, that is going to be opposed by the family, because we don't believe that a Commission of Inquiry can actually tackle that issue. That is the business for a court. And so what we anticipate is, in fact, that the president's just, chucking the can down the road. And you can imagine that we are going to be in for another long process, when what we wanted to see was a very swift response to the questions which are being raised. So again, question of delay.
Advocate Dumisa Nsebeza has spoken over the years numerous times about our failure to investigate and prosecute TRC cases, Yasmin. So that phrase, TRC, truth and reconciliation, how is that process damaged by our failure and what appears to be the lack of political will to prosecute these cases?
It's extremely compromising, because remember, it was founded on legislation that spoke to the fact that if people did not apply for amnesty or refused amnesty, that the law would take its course. And now, so many years later, almost 30 years later, nothing has been done. And of course, many of the people who did face the Truth Commission, who did come forward, perpetrators, they may be asking the question, we should all have stood back and waited, because look, nothing has actually happened to the people who didn't come forward. And the reason that we now are having to conduct these inquests is because we had some truth, but not really the truth about who are implicated and where, in fact, the authorization and the planning and the chain of command are, which is really what we want to have out of the Cradock Four inquest, which is looking at the question of command responsibility. And that's the question that we need to ask. It's not just about the obstruction of justice, but it's also I would say, the tainting of the democratic basis upon which the transition came into being. And it raises fundamental questions about the right to equality and freedom and dignity, which many of the victims have lost, actually.
Is this process...
It's a betrayal, as many of them say.
Apologies for that interruption, Yasmin. There is there's a bit of a delay in our connection, and so I thought you had finished your thought. But I want to ask you, is the inquest, and even the inquests that have gone before, are they box-ticking exercises? I mean, for the families who are so desperate for closure, will they get that in a context where memories have faded, perpetrators have died, evidence that should have been archived perhaps was not archived?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of the families, the inquests have been an important step because it has continued the truth recovery process for many of them, which began with the Truth Commission. Then, of course, it has also led to the overturning of the rulings by the apartheid courts that nobody was responsible for their killings. And in fact, most of the judges have found that, in fact, the former state was responsible for the killings. And so for many families, that's an important step forward. And knowing who is responsible, I think, is really another important element. But at the same time, closure is a very tricky issue, because closure is also about knowing the exact details and knowing why these sorts of instructions were given, why the state responded in a particular way. And so while it's an important step, it's not enough. It has to be accompanied by some form of redress and also reparations as well. And that's when I think the journey for families to closure will begin.
Yeah, closure and justice in the context where, like in this case, there's been 40 years of trauma that these families have had to live through, and some of them didn't even see the beginning of an inquest.
No, I mean, just think about the children. You know, most of them didn't know what was going on at the time, and they weren't taken to the inquest. In fact, one of the children, I think she was still going to be born many months later. And so for them, the intergenerational trauma and carrying the pain of having to pursue this struggle is really bringing a lot of trauma for them.
Absolutely. You're talking about Tamani Kalata and her mother, Nomonde Kalata, was pregnant, I think 7 months pregnant.
Yeah.
At the time of her husband's murder. Yeah.